Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In our previous lecture, we talked about slavery and self-determination in the colonies, ways in which slaves were able to determine, at least to some degree, their own fate even within the institution of slavery. We're going to continue along that line of discussion in this lesson, but talking more specifically about slavery and resistance against the institution itself. And what we will see is there's a whole range of resistance from simple forms of cultural expression and independence all the way to slave rebellion and killing their masters. So let's start by looking at some forms of slave resistance that we might describe as relatively benign. That is, they're not really hurting the masters or hurting anyone for the slaves to maintain some of these kind of freedoms. Nonetheless, they are expressions of resistance against the restrictions being put upon them. So I've already discussed a number of these in the previous lecture, but in some cases they were able to maintain their traditional African languages or create new languages like Gullah or Geechee or other kinds of combinations involving mixes of English with African. Similarly, in some ways they were able to maintain African religious traditions or again kind of combine their traditions with Christianity or Southern Baptist or other kind of local religions so that they could preserve some of that traditional culture. I mentioned previously they might be able to maintain their African names even though they would always be renamed, but they might be able to keep their name in private circles. I mentioned also in some cases they were able to maintain their own traditions in cooking. Certainly I showed in the previous lecture if they were off on their own living in slave quarters at some distance away from the master's house, they might be able to cook their own recipes. They might also be able to maintain their own musical traditions. You see some examples of musical instruments that the slaves fashioned on this picture. Making jewelry and other kind of decorative items. And as I mentioned also in the previous lecture, in some cases they were able to maintain their own ceremonies. And this is a very famous picture of a slave wedding with the tradition of jumping over the broomstick. And we discussed in previous lectures that on the surface, slaves were not allowed to be married in a formal sense, but as we've seen, they were at times able to maintain those traditions to some degree behind closed doors, as long as it wasn't too obvious to the masters and others around them. It might go unnoticed or unpunished. So those are some examples of resistance that were relatively benign, kind of victimless crimes. They were just expressions of freedom, pushing back against the restrictions put upon them. There were many other examples of the ways that slaves might resist, some of them not so benign. These are more overt and even violent forms of expression. So they might do things like damaging the master's tools. In other cases, they could act like they didn't understand what they were doing, if they were working with a tool in an incorrect way such that it was damaged. They might also work slowly, and this could be very hard to detect. If you were watching them, they might just put 50% effort or 60% effort instead of 100% effort, and the owners or overseers might not realize that they were not working as hard as they possibly could have. And then, again, they might just pretend that they didn't know how to do the work or couldn't understand what the master was trying to get them to do. Here are the words of one English traveler commenting on this. To be sure, a new Negro, if he must be broke, either from obstinacy or, which I am more apt to suppose, from greatness of soul, will require more hard discipline than a young spaniel. You would really be surprised at their perseverance. Let 100 men show him how to hoe or drive a wheelbarrow, he'll still take the one by the bottom or the other by the wheel. and they often die before they can be conquered. Now, it's clear to those of us as historians looking back that this kind of ignorance was faked. Uh, Obviously, the workers would have understood how to use the tools, but it was to their advantage to act like they didn't know how to do it. And of course, this is even more clear when we realize that the hoe was the chief agricultural tool utilized in West Africa, where many of the slaves would have come from. So, of course, they knew how to use the hoe. There are many other examples of slave resistance that at times could cause great harm to the master or their family. Slaves might engage in things like arson or poison or outright attack. And things like arson or poisoning the master could actually be quite hard to detect or realize who might have done it. And thus, if they wanted to start a fire, maybe they could rearrange the coals in the oven in such a way that it might start a fire down the road. And poisoning food, again, they might just act like the food didn't turn out right or it was inadvertent poisoning. And then there are instances of outright attack. And these might be more rare, but we have many, many accounts from the slave diaries and other sources that talk about slaves just kind of reaching a point where they're not going to take it anymore and lashing out and attacking their masters or attacking their overseers. A final example that I want to mention here, one last act of resistance, is running away. Again, there are many variations on this theme. Lots of examples that we know of slaves running away with the intention of coming back. They might just sneak off for a few hours or perhaps a day and return. Again, just kind of reaching their breaking point. They needed a break, and then they would return. And then, of course, in many other instances, running away with the intent of trying to flee to freedom. Now, we're going to talk about that process a lot more in future lectures because we start to see a more established kind of network that would allow slaves to run away seeking freedom. In the period we're talking about here, it's a little bit more difficult for slaves to run away because it's not always clear where they're going to go. Right? So when we talk about slavery in the antebellum period, 1830s and 40s and 50s, and we talk about the Underground Railroad, you have a more clear path to a place where you can go and be free. In the colonial era, it's a little trickier, although we're going to talk about that in the next lesson when I talk about slave rebellions. Some of those rebellions were geared towards trying to run to freedom, even in this earlier colonial era. So we're going to talk about that example more specifically in the next lesson.